Eileen Gowan is celebrating her birthday with her family.
Happy 60th birthday, Granny.
Happy birthday, Mom.
Happy birthday, Mom.
She didn't like getting older, that's for sure. But she still looked good for being 60.
Okay, let me get this food ready. I'm starving.
She was getting her buzz on cooking, just in her element in the kitchen. She was an awesome cook.
Can I help?
You can get me another beer.
Eileen and Sam were dating off and on for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years.
My mom was married 3 times. I believe she was a hopeless romantic, and she was always looking for that right person.
Cheers.
Cheers. She definitely wanted things to work with Sam. They seemed like they were having a pretty good day together. She just loved that we were all together. I just wish I would have done more. I wish I could have made it more special.
How can I help you, ma'am?
I need to report a missing person.
Nicole came into police records and reported her mother missing on the 14th of February, 2023. She last heard from her mother the morning of the 13th.
I spoke to her at like 8:30 in the morning, and she told me that Sam kicked her out and she had nowhere to go. There was arguing going on and it wasn't good. So a friend of hers, Mike, offered to let her stay for a couple days. I didn't have Mike's number. I called Sam. He said he hasn't heard from her. It just was very odd to me. I was worried.
I'll get an officer to look at this.
So Nicole provided us with 2 names, Sam Brammer, Eileen's on-again, off-again boyfriend, and Mike Brockman, who she was currently living with. So we needed to speak with both of them. Right away on the 15th of February, we reached out to Sam Brammer and requested an interview with him. The missing persons case was initially assigned to Sergeant Ted Roberts.
I'm the sergeant that you talked to on the phone. My name's Ted Roberts. You know, Eileen, she's never done this kind of thing before. She's never just, took off and gone.
What she does is she comes to me, she's moved in with me 4 or 5 times. But usually when she moves in with me, she stays away from home.
He explains that they would be together, they would get in these arguments, and they would break up.
Sam tells detectives that Eileen messaged him on February 13th, the same day that Nicole last heard from her mom.
She texted me.
Okay.
And wanted to know if I would come and get her.
He said she needed to ride from Sugar's Diner to Mike Brockman's residence.
My mom was working at Sugar's in Council Bluffs as a server. She would come in at 5, 6 in the morning and clean it and then serve for the morning shift and then come back for her afternoon shift.
Sam says that he picked up Eileen in his 1999 Ford F-150 at 8:30 in the morning. They leave Sugar's Diner, and he takes her to Mike Brockman's residence.
I pull up, she gets in the truck. We take off and drops her off there. Then I'm left.
It's about 2.5 miles from Sugar's Diner. He would have dropped her off there at about 8:40 in the morning.
Sam indicated that he had not heard from her again.
When Sam mentions that, it certainly makes us want to talk to Mike sooner than later.
Detectives bring in Mike Brockman for questioning.
I'm Detective Brannigan. This is Sergeant Roberts. Thanks for coming in today.
Law enforcement wants to know when was the last time Mike Brockman saw Eileen? How did that relationship work or go?
Tell me how you met Eileen.
Mike said he's a regular patron of Sugar's Diner. He knows Eileen from frequenting that business. We asked him if he had any type of contact with Eileen.
Was there ever anything sexual between you and Eileen?
He flat out denied that. He said he had no desire to have an intimate relationship with her.
Why was Eileen staying at your place?
He allowed her to stay on this couch and stay there for a short period of time. On Sunday night, had a conversation with her that that was going to be her last night. She needed to find another place to stay. And he would take her to work that morning on the 13th, Monday morning, and he would come pick her up, gather her things, and he would take her wherever she wanted to go.
What time did you drop Eileen off at Sugar's Diner Monday morning?
He said he dropped her off at about 5 in the morning.
Thanks, Mike.
And he says he worked all day. He arrives home around 5 o'clock in the evening, so he waits until about 8 p.m. He still hasn't heard from Eileen.
What did you do then?
So he gathers up Eileen's belongings. He drives to Sugar's himself and drops them off.
Mike's account is directly contradicted by Sam's interview that he picked up Eileen and he drove her straight out to Mike Brockman's house.
Both Sam and Mike are released, pending further investigation.
Police are now trying to verify the stories that they've received from Sam and from Mike. First thing they do is start looking for video. So they reach out to Sugars.
Morning. I'm Sergeant Roberts. This is Detective Brannigan.
Morning.
We'd like to ask you some questions.
That morning, Eileen came in early. She did her cleaning. Then she left at 8:30 in the morning.
Was there anything odd or unusual about Eileen's mood or behavior?
She was supposed to be back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and she didn't show up. It was completely out of the ordinary.
Do you have any surveillance cameras on the premises?
Sugar's Diner has a camera out the back door, has a camera at the front, at the entrance. What we're hoping to see is Eileen come to work and how she's acting. We want to make sure that she's, first off, acting normal.
Can you start just before 8:30 a.m. on the backdoor camera? Stop.
There's Eileen.
We see Eileen walking across the video screen. She leaves work. She doesn't look like she's in any type of distress.
Okay, keep playing.
They're really hoping that, as that camera advances, that they will be able to see what happens next, where she goes, who she's with. Sam indicated that he was driving her out, and he had a fairly distinctive truck. He had a Ford F-150.
Rewind and play that again.
It's Brammer.
We see Sam's truck drive directly in front of that camera angle.
Play that again. Stop. Zoom in.
We can clearly see Eileen sitting in the passenger seat of that truck. So that confirms the statement from Sam that he did pick her up that morning at 8:30, and she was healthy, alive, and with him voluntarily.
It's time to start trying to verify Mike Brockman's story. He had indicated that he had dropped Eileen's belongings off that evening at the back door of Sugar's.
Show me the camera that covers the back. Play just before 8 p.m. Stop there.
We can clearly see Mike Brockman removing some items from his truck and leaving them at the back door. And then he gets back in his truck and he drives off. So he was telling us the truth. Now we know that at 8:30 in the morning that she's alive and well in the passenger seat of Sam Brammer's truck. At about 8 o'clock at night, Mike Brockman is dropping off her belongings at the back door. So we need to be able to put more things into that timeline. We need to know where she was at what time, who she was with, what she was doing. We don't have any of this information yet.
See, now police have to start running down the details does Mike Brockman have an alibi for his whereabouts on the day of February 13th? And so detectives went to his work.
The manager pulled up his timesheets on the morning of the 13th. He clocks in around 6 o'clock in the morning. Mike Brockman was still there talking with coworkers when she left, around 4 o'clock. Mike Brockman was at work all day long on the 13th, just like he told us.
Mike has a pretty solid alibi. So Sam Bramer was the last one that has been seen with her at 8:30 in the morning.
Investigators switch gears.
The police are trying to find out who has spoken with Eileen, who has seen Eileen after Sam had picked her up from Sugar's. So they reach out to friends and family, and they end up speaking with Eileen's mom, Kathleen, at Dudley Court Apartments.
Kathleen tells detectives that Eileen visited her at around 8:45 a.m.
How was Eileen when you saw her on February 13th?
Kathleen said that she was acting completely normal.
What did Eileen do when she came in?
Kathleen said that she went into the apartment, went straight into the bedroom where the safe is kept, retrieved the safe, and she left the apartment. That safe had about $1,200 into it, according to her mom. That's a pretty good, sizable amount of money.
Eileen's visit to her mom's apartment conflicts with Sam's account of her movements that morning.
Sam's interview indicated that he picked up Eileen at Sugar's at 8:32, and he drove her straight out to Mike Brockman's house. He lived north and east of Sugar's, about 5-10 minutes away. Eileen's mom's apartment is around 15 minutes west of Sugar's. And if he drove her straight out to Mike Brockman's house, then she couldn't be at her mom's apartment at about 8:45 a.m., 10 minutes later. So law enforcement is looking to try to verify, again, the accuracy of the statements. They're able to acquire the surveillance footage from the Dudley Court Apartments.
Okay, start just before 8:40 a.m.
So at about 8:45 in the morning, we see Eileen enter Dudley Court. She comes in through the foyer. She gets on the elevator.
Next camera.
And then we see her come off the elevator on the second floor. And she walks directly to her mom's apartment.
Then she goes off camera. And then about 5 minutes later, you can see her coming out.
She's carrying the safe.
It was a small black safe with a handle on top. Why did she need that money? Did she need to just get away from everything for a little while? Or could she have gotten in trouble? Did she need to pay somebody off?
Back to the lobby camera.
She exits out of the lobby.
Unfortunately, there's no cameras that cover where she goes once she leaves. She's not seen with Sam Bramer, but he's the one that left Sugar's with her. And 15 minutes later, she's on camera at Dudley Court Apartments. So this is certainly pretty good evidence that she is still with Sam Bramer during this period of time.
Across town, Eileen's family struggles with her disappearance.
As time went, we became more and more concerned.
My brother, Jack, made a missing person flyer.
And we all went, every gas station, every bar, I mean, just every business that would let us put it up.
Hey there, Eileen Gowan, leave a message.
I was calling her, blowing her phone up, no response. My mom was my best friend. And so I knew I had to stay strong for the girls, but believe me, there was times that I couldn't.
Investigators refocus on Sam's movements on February 13th. They review the data from traffic cameras to trace where he went that day.
Sam told us that he picks her up at 8:30, took her to Mike Brockman's house, and he went back home.
There are a couple of surveillance cameras that were positioned between Sugar's and Mike Brockman's house that captured the highway. Sam's truck is not captured on that video. But Sam's truck is identified at 9:28 a.m. on the 13th, heading westbound on West Broadway at about 36th Street, which would be leading into Omaha, Nebraska. Still not in the direction of Mike's house, which is north and east of town.
The next surveillance camera photograph we receive is Sam returning, now traveling eastbound at the same location at 10:28 a.m., 1 hour later. So for 1 hour, he's somewhere in Nebraska. There is someone in the passenger side, but you can't see the passenger's face. Something just didn't look right, and it raised our suspicion.
Investigators invite Sam to the police department for a second interview.
We began talking with him again about his movements that day. Now this time, he knows that we have some questions. He's prepared, and he gives us a little bit more information.
So I went and picked her up, and she got in the truck, but she didn't want to go home right away. So me and her just went right down Broadway, and then she wanted to stop at her mom's house.
He tells us, well, I didn't take her straight to Mike Brockman's house. First, she needed to go see her mom. So we went to Dudley Court.
I stopped at her mom's house, and she was in there for, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes. She come out of there, got back in. She just said she wanted to talk to her mom. That's what she told me.
Did she come out with anything? Did she have anything?
She had her purse, and she had a black safe with her. She wanted to talk to me about helping her get in the apartment.
Now we know what that money was for. That money was to put down on an apartment, the deposit, first month's rent. We received video photos from Sherwood Apartments and located them walking up to the door, seeing that the office doors were closed, and then they left.
That confirms that part of his story, but he still ends up with the story that he drops her off at Mike Brockman's house.
Okay, and it's somewhere off of there is where you drop her off.
As soon as I pulled up, and she didn't want me to go in the driveway in case he was there, and that's when I went straight, turned around, and came back.
Okay.
And I hit straight home.
We know that he didn't take her to Mike Brockman's house because we have the video of him going back west. We have a camera at 36th and Broadway, and we have your truck going westbound at 9:28 a.m. going to Omaha.
I told you I went straight home. I don't remember going to Omaha.
Well, the camera doesn't lie. And then 1 hour later, you're coming back from Omaha, and you're going eastbound coming back into Council Bluffs. 1 hour later. Where'd you go?
I went straight home.
I know that he's not telling me the truth. I don't know why he's lying to me yet, but there's a lot of things that just aren't adding up. We'd like to look a little bit further in your phone and get the location information off of it so that we can see where you went during that time, okay? We applied for search warrants for Sam and Eileen's phone. We can find out the movements of their phones.
While investigators wait for the phone data, they review the surveillance footage from the apartments where Sam lives.
Play the camera that faces the parking lot.
That's Sam's truck.
This camera angle shows Sam Brammer arriving home at 12:59 on the 13th, the day that Eileen went missing. He gets out, fiddles around with his truck. Sam takes some things out of the truck and walks away.
What's he got in the bag?
Is there a camera that shows where Sam goes?
Right at the entrance is a dumpster. We can see Sam, and he walks toward that dumpster carrying whatever it is that he's carrying.
What's he throwing in the trash?
It's hard to tell. Go back to the first camera.
He returns to his truck. He's opening up the doors. He looks like he's cleaning a couple of things out.
Why is he spending so much time in the passenger side?
That door was open. There's a tree there. It's hard to see exactly what he's doing. Then he closes up the truck and walks back to his apartment. We can clearly see that Eileen's not in the truck at this time. She's gone, and now he's throwing things away right when he gets home. That raises some red flags with me.
By the time we realized that footage existed, it was too late to find out what he'd put in the dumpster. That dumpster had already been emptied.
Okay, let's just keep watching and see if Sam comes back out to his truck.
The surveillance camera on the 14th shows him leaving in his truck after dark, about 8 p.m.
Fast forward, let's see when he comes back.
He returns at about 10 p.m., so he's gone for about 2 hours. We need to know where Sam went. So we still have some unresolved questions that we would like to talk with him about. We had tried to contact him, leaving messages, but we didn't get any response.
Investigators issue a bolo for Sam and his pickup.
You can light it up. It's approaching him.
A patrol officer spots the truck in Council Bluffs later that afternoon.
Sam is obviously beginning to elude. He speeds up. It's a dangerous pursuit. He's driving recklessly. There's traffic. The speeds are getting pretty high. He's running stop signs. So it's determined that this pursuit needs to end.
A warrant is obtained for Sam's arrest for eluding.
Three days later, Sam Brammer turns up at the police department.
I'm Sam Brammer. I got outstanding warrants. I'm here to give myself up.
I drove straight to the station and prepared to talk to him.
Detective Brannigan questions Sam for a third time about his movements on the day that Eileen disappeared.
I'm trying to really lock him in to a final route that he took.
Where did you go between 9:28 and 10:28 with Eileen?
He now admits to having new memories. He now remembers that they did actually travel over across to Omaha.
He said they went to Carter Lake, to the park, which is actually in Omaha. And he said that they fooled around a little bit. So that was his reason for being in Omaha for an hour.
And where did you go then?
I dropped her off at Mike's place. Look, if you don't believe me, I can show you the route we took.
And I thought, you know, that's a great idea. Let's do that. We turned up 205th Street, and 205th is where Mike Brockman lives. He says, this right here is where I turned around. She got out, grabbed her purse, grabbed her safe, and she just stood there as I drove away. So he's able to claim at that point he has no idea where she went because he last saw her standing on the side of 205th Street between two homes. I absolutely know he's lying at that point. He never made it there. He never went to 205th Street. So we drive back to his apartment. I pulled up right behind his truck, and I asked him, Sam, do you mind if we take a look in your truck? You're not going to find anything, he said. We just want to look and see if there's anything in there that tells us that there was a disturbance between you and Eileen inside that truck. So, Detective Fletcher looked inside the vehicle. He didn't see anything completely out of the ordinary. Sam Brammer knew now that we were definitely interested in this truck. We wanted to see inside that truck. But at this point, we only have a missing person. We don't have a crime. So I don't have probable cause to seize or search anything.
Sam is taken back to the station and released on bail for his traffic violations. Investigators refocus on tracing Sam's movements on February 13th, the day Eileen disappeared.
When Sam comes back from Omaha, the traffic camera captures his truck at 10:28, but we didn't know where he went after that. So I requested a couple of our detectives to go canvass every business in that area for any kind of video footage that they could find, and they did just that. We were able to secure video from one of the businesses in this area. It's a Burger King in the 3200 block of West Broadway, right by the traffic camera at 36th and Broadway.
Play from there.
We can see Sam Brammer's truck pull up to the drive-thru.
Okay, rewind. Let's have another look.
It captures both him and Eileen in the passenger side. We know it's Eileen, but the way she's positioned is very awkward. It's strange.
Zoom into Eileen.
It looks like her right arm has crossed her body. She doesn't look right, and all you can see is her lower body. And nothing moves. The whole time that he's sitting there, nothing moves. We watched it several times. I never thought that I would ever see a piece of video footage like this. We started noticing Brammer.
Look at his chest. It's really moving up and down.
He was taking very large breaths. He was gasping. You could see the nervousness on Brammer. After that, we were convinced that Eileen was either hurt very bad and unconscious or already deceased. And then we received a phone call.
911, what's the address of your emergency?
Crescent, Iowa.
What's going on?
So we're driving down the road, and there is a dead body on the side of the road.
Do you know if it's male or female?
It's female for sure.
On February 26th, a 911 call came in alerting authorities to a body that had been located. I was the on-call supervisor that day, and so that's why I was dispatched to it. I could see that the body was on the side of the roadway in the ditch. The body had jeans on and a coat with a zipper, and I was aware of the clothing that Eileen had last been seen in. So it was pretty apparent that that was her.
Detective, you seen a black safe box? Nope.
The safe wasn't anywhere in the area. She was missing her glasses. One of her shoes was missing. Her purse was not in the area. Her phone wasn't around her.
When could she have been dumped here?
It had snowed several days before, and so the snow had begun to melt. That's when the body was able to be seen. We could see that there really wasn't snow underneath the body, which suggested that she had been there prior to when it snowed, since roughly the 13th, the day she went missing. There was a laceration on the top of her head, and there was also a ligature mark on her neck that we noted.
The number of contusions and injuries that Eileen sustained, it was very clear that she had been beaten up. She was involved in a very physical altercation. Now my investigation ramps up. Now we absolutely have a homicide.
Investigators contact Eileen's family with the news.
Detective Brannigan just said, I'm sorry to inform you, but it was your mom's body that we found. I just lost it.
That little sliver of hope is, of course, gone then. You don't ever think that something like this is going to happen to someone you know.
I couldn't tell my daughter that the person she loved so much is never coming back.
I felt between helpless and hopeless. My focus was they better get him before I do.
Detectives secure a warrant to search Sam's apartment and his pickup truck.
The truck wasn't there that night. We had announced ourselves, entered. Sam was inside the residence. He didn't want to talk to us.
Put Sam on the stairs and search the apartment.
Sam shares that apartment with his granddaughter, Emily. We asked Emily what happened to her grandpa's truck.
My grandpa told me to tell anybody who asks about the truck and where it is. He told me to say, I don't know. That's all he told me to say, was I don't know where it is. I told the police officer that a few days prior, my grandpa asked me if I could follow him in his truck to the scrapyard in Carter Lake. He pulled his truck in to go get crushed.
We received the still photos from Lakeside Auto Salvage. We can clearly see his truck, his driver's license, and him in his truck. He had the car shredded.
Our belief was that there would have been incriminating forensic evidence in that truck. He was able to get that truck crushed before we were able to get it searched.
We missed that opportunity. It just makes you shake your head. It's unbelievable. What else could happen?
Detectives received Sam's and Eileen's cell phone data from February 13th.
We were able to triangulate their locations with cell towers. The information that we received shows the phones traveling together up until about 11 o'clock in the morning. And right about that time, the phones are no longer communicating, which means they were either turned off or they were placed on airplane mode.
Investigators search for surveillance cameras close to the location of the last ping from Eileen's phone.
We were able to find some surveillance video from a Department of Transportation camera out in Trainer, Iowa, on Highway 92.
At 11:46 a.m. on February 13th, a camera captures Sam Brammer's pickup.
Sam's truck is seen traveling east on Highway 92 through Trainer, Iowa. And he drives out of sight, continuing east. And at 12:34, we again see Sam's truck, this time traveling on Highway 92 back toward Council Bluffs. Now we can clearly see through his windshield as he's driving. He's the only person inside that truck. But Eileen's phone is with him. Sam continues all the way to his home. When he gets home at 12:59, we know Eileen is not in that truck because he has it all opened up. I believe that Sam dumped her somewhere east of Trainer just to get her out of his truck. He needed to find someplace to hide her quickly.
The next day, we know he's gone for 2 hours on the 14th, as we see the surveillance video showing him leaving the apartment complex about 8 p.m. and returning at 10 p.m. That would have been plenty of time for him to drive, retrieve her body, take her to the different location, and drop her body on Mormon Bridge Road. Law enforcement is really, looking at motive at this point. So we obtained Sam's bank records.
I came upon one deposit that occurred on the 15th of February. This was a deposit of $1,200 in cash. This amount of money matches the amount of money that should have been in the safe that Eileen had. Video from the bank does show Sam Brammer enter the bank and give cash to the teller.
This was very significant because Eileen has the safe that has $1,200 cash in it that has gone missing, and then 2 days later, he's showing up at the bank depositing, coincidentally, $1,200 in cash. He had taken possession of her safe.
So at this point, we had enough probable cause to issue warrants for Sam Brammer's arrest.
On May 24th, Sam Brammer is arrested.
He was formally charged in August of 2023 with second-degree murder. And then the trial began in mid-November.
Prosecutors lay out the events that led to Eileen's murder.
Sam picked her up at Sugar's at 8:32. He drove her to her mom's apartment where she retrieved the safe. Then they started heading westbound through the city of Council Bluffs, across to Omaha. They drove to Carter Lake.
Well, no. Come on, come on. Come on, jump out. It's a beautiful day. Come on. Yeah. Come here.
I posited to the jury that he's assaulting her with something more than his fist, something significant enough to cause a laceration to the left side of her scalp. He brutally assaulted her while he was choking her, and during that assault, she died. He then puts her back in the truck and heads back into Council Bluffs. At 10:36 a.m., she can be seen now awkwardly slumped in the drive-thru at Burger King. We have cell phone data and the surveillance video that showed that he was heading east toward Traynor, where he dumped her body. Shortly thereafter, he's heading back westbound, back into Council Bluffs, without Eileen. And then he arrives back home, the Cottonwood Apartments. He grabs something from the bed of the truck, and we see him walk across and deposit that item in the dumpster. The next day, he's leaving the apartment complex about 8 p.m. to collect her body from maybe where it had initially been dumped to where it ultimately ends up north of town at Mormon Bridge Road and 152nd. Then Sam Brammer deposited $1,200 cash, probably taken from her safe. On January 18th, 2024, the judge sentenced Sam Brammer to the maximum of 65 years in prison for murder in the second degree, abuse of a corpse, and theft in the second degree. Mike Brockman was cleared of any wrongdoing whatsoever.
Surveillance footage was really paramount in this investigation.
Even though the crime itself was not captured on video, almost the entire before and almost the entire after was captured on surveillance video.
Without the cameras, we would have possibly never solved this crime.
It was partial release when we found out that he was guilty. But then the other part of it is it didn't bring Mom back. So I would give anything to talk to my mom one more time.
I just miss her big personality, and it's infuriating that someone could take that for no good reason. I would just choose to remember her as somebody who was always willing and able to do her best for her kids and her grandkids.
She was funny. She loved life. She had this weird laugh that was contagious. She was just a great person. Whenever I needed her, whether it was in the middle of the night or she had something going on, she would stop what she's doing and come to be with me. Just anything. She was there. I love and miss her very much.
Next time on See No Evil.
911, you said yes, of your emergency.
Cause of death had been ruled a homicide. They said it was very clear strangulation.
I noticed several cameras. We see the suspect. We need to find out who he is. I want to get this person off the streets immediately.
The call came in just after midnight. Not a scream. Not a gunshot. Just silence and a front door hanging half open in the cold Illinois wind. The street looked ordinary. Quiet suburb. Two-story homes. Porch lights glowing faintly against the dark winter sky. The kind of place where neighbors wave across lawns and kids ride bikes until sunset. The kind of place where nothing like this is supposed to happen. But that night, something had already gone terribly wrong. A patrol officer stepped out of his cruiser and approached the house slowly, his boots crunching against frost-covered gravel. Dispatch had received a strange request, a welfare check. A coworker reported that someone hadn't shown up for work. No phone call. No explanation. Just absence. Inside the house, the lights were still on. The officer knocked once. No answer. He pushed the door gently. It creaked open. And the quiet inside felt wrong. The living room looked almost untouched. A lamp glowing beside a couch. A half-finished mug of coffee on the table. Television still humming softly to an empty room. It was the kind of scene investigators would later describe as frozen in time. But something else caught the officer's eye. A chair had been knocked over. Not dramatically. Just slightly, like someone had stood up too fast. He called out again. Nothing. Room by room, the house revealed pieces of a puzzle no one yet understood. A purse on the kitchen counter. Keys beside it. A wallet still inside. Whoever lived here had not planned to leave. And yet they were gone. Within hours, police tape wrapped around the small property on the edge of town. Red and blue lights flashed across quiet windows. Neighbors stood in coats and pajamas, whispering across the cold sidewalk. Something terrible had happened here. But no one could say exactly what. The missing person at the center of the mystery was 34-year-old Melissa Carter, a woman most people described with the same words. Quiet. Responsible. Friendly. Melissa worked as an office administrator for a small insurance company downtown. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Every weekday morning she arrived before 8, coffee in hand, ready to sort paperwork and answer phones. Routine defined her life. Morning commute. Work day. Evening walk with her dog. Dinner at home. Nothing about Melissa Carter suggested danger. Nothing about her suggested enemies. Friends later told detectives the same thing again and again. She wasn't the kind of person who disappeared. But by sunrise that January morning in 1999, that was exactly what had happened. Melissa Carter had vanished. No struggle visible. No blood. No obvious sign of violence. Just a silent house and a life interrupted. Detectives began asking the questions that always come first in cases like this. Where did she go? Who saw her last? And why would someone disappear in the middle of an ordinary evening? The timeline, at first, seemed painfully normal. Melissa left work at 5:12 p.m. Her co-workers remembered seeing her bundle into a winter coat and wave goodbye at the door. Outside, snow had started to fall lightly across central Illinois. Nothing heavy. Just a thin layer dusting the streets. She stopped at a grocery store a few blocks from home. Security footage showed her pushing a small cart through the aisles, bread, milk, pasta, a frozen dinner. Ordinary purchases for an ordinary night. At 6:03 p.m., she paid in cash. At 6:07 p.m., she walked out the front doors. After that, the trail became blurry. A neighbor later reported seeing Melissa's car pull into the driveway around 6:20 p.m. The porch light clicked on shortly afterward. Her dog barked briefly, then quieted. Everything looked routine. Nothing looked suspicious. Then silence. Phone calls went unanswered that evening. By morning, Melissa hadn't shown up for work. By midnight the next day, police were inside her home. And the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the situation became. The groceries from the store were still sitting on the kitchen counter. One bag had been opened. Bread placed neatly in a cabinet. The milk remained on the counter. Still cold. Still sealed. Detectives stared at the scene for a long moment. It suggested something unsettling. Melissa had returned home. She had begun unpacking. Then something interrupted her. Something sudden enough that she walked away mid-task. Something serious enough that she never came back. Theories started forming quickly. Maybe she left voluntarily. Maybe she went somewhere unexpectedly. Maybe she planned to return later. But that explanation collapsed almost immediately. Her purse was still in the house. Her car sat in the driveway. Her dog was inside, restless and hungry when officers arrived. No woman disappears voluntarily and leaves every piece of her life behind. Detectives knew that. And by the second day of the investigation, the case had shifted from missing person to something far darker. Now the question wasn't just where Melissa Carter had gone. The question was whether she had ever left the house alive. Crime scene technicians combed through every inch of the property. Fingerprint powder coated doorknobs. Evidence bags filled with fibers, dust, fragments of everyday life. And yet the house refused to give up its secrets. No blood. No broken windows. No obvious signs of forced entry. But one detail lingered. A small scratch mark on the back door frame. At first glance it looked insignificant, the kind of mark that could appear over years of normal wear. But investigators noticed something strange about its position. The scratch sat exactly at the height where a lock mechanism might be forced open. And suddenly the theory shifted again. Maybe Melissa hadn't let someone inside. Maybe someone had forced their way in. The possibility sent a ripple of fear through the quiet Illinois community. Because if that was true, the person responsible might still be nearby. Interviews began immediately. Neighbors. Co-workers. Friends. Family. Detectives built timelines, cross-checked alibis, searched for anyone who might have crossed paths with Melissa Carter that night. Most people had nothing unusual to report. One neighbor remembered hearing a car engine sometime around 7 p.m. Another thought they saw headlights near the driveway shortly after dark. But no one could provide a clear description. No one could identify a suspect. Days passed. Then weeks. Search teams combed nearby woods and empty fields. Divers scanned ponds frozen beneath winter ice. Every lead ended the same way. Nothing. Melissa Carter had disappeared without a trace. And as winter turned slowly toward spring, the investigation began to stall. Detectives faced the most frustrating reality in criminal investigations. A case with no body. No weapon. No witnesses. Only questions. The file thickened with paperwork but offered no answers. And slowly, painfully, the story that once dominated local headlines began fading from public view. But inside the police department the case never truly disappeared. Because one detail kept bothering investigators. A single piece of evidence that didn't make sense. Something small. Something overlooked. Something that would sit quietly in an evidence locker for years waiting for someone to look at it again. And when they finally did, it would send shockwaves through the entire investigation. Because buried inside that forgotten detail was the first real sign that Melissa Carter's disappearance was not random. It was deliberate. Carefully planned. And possibly connected to someone much closer than anyone had imagined. The Illinois winter of 1999 would come and go. Years would pass. New crimes would demand attention. But in the back of an evidence room sealed inside a plastic bag, a single overlooked item waited silently. A clue that detectives had once dismissed as meaningless. A clue that would one day reopen the entire case. And when it did, it would reveal a truth far darker than the quiet neighborhood had ever feared. In the weeks after Melissa Carter vanished, the quiet Illinois neighborhood began to feel different. Front doors stayed locked a little earlier at night. Porch lights remained on longer. Curtains were drawn tighter. The kind of invisible tension that settles over a community after something unexplainable had happened. Because the truth was impossible to ignore. A woman had disappeared from her own home and no one knew how. Detectives continued working the case long after the media vans left town. Every morning the investigation resumed with the same stack of questions. Where did Melissa go? Who had been near the house that night? And why did the scene inside her home feel so incomplete, like the story had been interrupted halfway through a sentence? Forensic teams revisited the property again and again. Every surface dusted. Every fiber examined beneath harsh fluorescent lights inside the lab. The results were frustrating. Most fingerprints inside the house belonged to Melissa. Others matched co-workers and friends who had visited weeks earlier. Nothing unusual. Nothing violent. But that small scratch mark on the back door still bothered investigators. The mark wasn't deep enough to confirm forced entry. But it wasn't random either. Someone had applied pressure there, possibly with a tool. Detectives examined the lock mechanism carefully. No damage. Still functional. But something about the angle of the scratch suggested an attempt, one that might have failed. And that detail raised a chilling possibility. What if whoever came to the house hadn't broken in? What if Melissa herself had opened the door? The investigation shifted again. Now detectives started focusing on Melissa's personal life, her relationships, her routine, anyone who might have had a reason to knock on her door that night. They began with the obvious. Friends. Co-workers. Family members. One by one, detectives sat across interview tables and asked the same quiet question. Did Melissa have any problems with anyone? Most people gave the same answer. No. Melissa Carter had lived a remarkably uneventful life. No public arguments. No messy breakups. No debts. No obvious enemies. But the more investigators listened, the more subtle details began to surface. A coworker mentioned something small. Melissa had seemed distracted during the last week at work. Not frightened. Just uneasy. She had been checking the office windows more often than usual. At first, the comment sounded insignificant. But detectives wrote it down. Then another coworker mentioned something similar. Melissa had asked if anyone noticed a car sitting outside the office parking lot a few days earlier. A dark sedan. Parked across the street. Engine running. No one inside the building had thought much about it. But Melissa apparently had. The detective circled that note in the case file. A dark sedan. Possibly watching her. Suddenly the timeline felt less random. Investigators pulled traffic cameras from nearby intersections, hoping to identify vehicles that passed Melissa's house on the night she vanished. But the technology in 1999 was limited. Grainy footage. Poor lighting. Snow falling across the lens. Hours of review produced almost nothing. Almost. One camera located 2 blocks from Melissa's street captured a vehicle turning into the neighborhood around 6:45 p.m. Dark-colored. 4-door. The video quality made identification impossible. But the timing matched the window when something might have happened inside the house. The car never appeared on the camera again. Detectives couldn't confirm whether it belonged to a neighbor, a visitor, or someone far more dangerous. Still, the possibility lingered. Someone may have been watching Melissa Carter. Someone may have followed her home. Meanwhile, the search outside the house continued. Volunteers combed through wooded areas beyond the neighborhood, walking in long silent lines through frozen brush. Police helicopters scanned farm fields stretching for miles beyond the town limits. Dogs were brought in. Scent trails were attempted. But the problem remained the same. Too much time had already passed. By the time investigators realized Melissa had vanished, the trail had grown cold. Painfully cold. Weeks later, detectives received a call that briefly reignited hope. A truck driver passing through a rural road outside town reported seeing something strange near a drainage ditch several miles away. Police arrived quickly. The scene looked unsettling at first glance. A patch of disturbed earth. Tire tracks leading away. Investigators began digging carefully through frozen soil. But after hours of work, the result was disappointing. Nothing. No body. No clothing. Just ground churned by winter weather and heavy vehicles. Another lead dissolved into uncertainty. Inside the police department, the investigation slowly transformed into what detectives fear most. A puzzle with missing pieces. Every theory felt possible and impossible at the same time. Maybe someone had abducted Melissa. Maybe she knew the person and left voluntarily. Maybe something had gone wrong inside the house and the evidence had been removed. Each explanation had flaws. Each required assumptions that couldn't yet be proven. Months slipped by. The case file thickened with interview transcripts and forensic reports. Still no answers. And yet one detail from the crime scene continued to haunt investigators. The chair in the living room. It had been knocked over. Not smashed. Not broken. Just tipped sideways like someone had stood up suddenly. Or like someone had been pushed. The position suggested movement. A moment of surprise. Possibly a confrontation. Detectives reconstructed the scene repeatedly inside their minds. Melissa unpacking groceries. Bread placed in the cabinet. Milk still on the counter. Then a knock at the door. A voice she recognized. A reason to open it. What happened next remained unknown. But the fallen chair suggested the moment when everything changed. The moment when Melissa Carter's ordinary life collided with something violent. Something irreversible. Still, there was no physical proof. No blood. No body. Without that evidence, prosecutors couldn't move forward. The case lingered in a strange gray area between suspicion and certainty. For the Carter family, the waiting was unbearable. Melissa's parents spoke with investigators constantly during the first months. Every new lead brought hope and every dead end reopened the same wound. They kept her bedroom exactly as it had been. Clothes still hanging neatly in the closet. Photographs lining the dresser. Every holiday season they left a place at the dinner table. Because until someone proved otherwise, Melissa Carter was still missing. Not dead. Not gone. Just missing. But inside the police department, a quiet shift had begun. Detectives started referring to the investigation using a phrase no family ever wants to hear. Cold case. Not officially. Not yet. But the word lingered in conversations. Because time was passing. Witness memories were fading. And the trail that might have once led directly to Melissa Carter's killer was slowly disappearing. Then, almost a year after the disappearance, a new piece of information arrived. Small. Unexpected. But deeply unsettling. A man living several blocks away from Melissa's house contacted police after seeing a television segment about the case. He claimed that on the night Melissa vanished he had seen something strange while walking his dog. At first he hadn't thought much about it. But the memory had stayed with him. He described hearing a loud sound, something like a door slamming, followed by a brief shout. Not a scream. Just a sharp voice raised in anger. The sound came from Melissa's direction. The witness had paused for a moment, listening. Then he saw headlights pull away from the street. A dark car. Moving quickly. Too quickly for a quiet residential road. The witness couldn't see the driver. But he remembered something specific. The car had stopped briefly at the corner stop sign before accelerating away. And when it did, the tires spun against the snowy pavement. That detail caught the attention of detectives immediately, because investigators reviewing the street earlier had found something unusual near that same intersection. Faint marks in the snow, partially melted by morning sunlight. At the time, they had assumed the tracks belonged to a normal vehicle passing through the neighborhood. But now the timing felt too precise to ignore. A dark sedan. Seen near the house. Heard leaving quickly. Possibly within minutes of the moment Melissa Carter disappeared. For the first time in months, detectives felt the investigation shifting again. Not solved. Not even close. But moving. And somewhere inside the growing case file another piece of evidence sat quietly waiting. An item collected during the very first search of Melissa's house. Something so ordinary no one had given it much attention. At least not yet. But years later, when investigators finally looked at it again, that small overlooked detail would explode open the entire case. Because it contained a secret no one in 1999 had the technology to see. A secret that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the town, but the disappearance of Melissa Carter refused to fade with the snow. By early spring of 1999, the investigation had entered a strange phase, the period detectives sometimes call the quiet middle of a case. The early chaos had passed. The patrol cars had left the street. The television crews had moved on to newer tragedies. But inside the police department, the questions remained exactly where they had started. What happened inside that house? And who had walked away afterward? The case file had grown thick with reports, witness statements, maps, and photographs. Detectives had reconstructed Melissa's final known hours dozens of times, tracing her movements through the quiet rhythm of an ordinary weekday. Work. Grocery store. Home. 3 simple steps. And somewhere between step 2 and step 3 the entire story had collapsed into mystery. Investigators turned their focus back to Melissa's workplace. The insurance office where she spent most of her days looked as calm as ever, beige walls, humming copy machines, the quiet shuffle of paperwork. But detectives believed the answers might be hidden in small details that co-workers had overlooked. They interviewed everyone again. And this time, something new surfaced. A receptionist named Carol mentioned a phone call Melissa had received 3 days before she vanished. At the time it hadn't seemed strange. The office handled dozens of calls each day. But Carol remembered one small detail. Melissa's voice had changed during the conversation. Not angry. Not scared. Just tense. Carol remembered watching Melissa slowly turn away from her desk and lower her voice. The call lasted less than a minute. Afterward, Melissa sat quietly for several seconds staring at the phone before returning to work. Detectives asked the obvious question. Did you hear what the caller said? Carol shook her head. No words. Just tone. But the tone had bothered her enough that the memory stuck. Investigators pulled phone records from the office line. The call had come from a payphone. Location, a gas station roughly 8 miles from Melissa's house. The discovery raised immediate questions. Why would someone call her workplace from a payphone? Why not call her home directly? The records offered no answers. But the gas station location gave detectives something tangible to examine. They drove out there the next day. The station sat along a busy highway just outside town, the kind of place truckers used for quick stops and commuters grabbed coffee on the way to work. In 1999, the payphone stood beside the building near the ice machine. Detectives checked the area carefully. No cameras. No witnesses who remembered anything unusual. The call might have come from anyone. Still, the timing bothered them. 3 days before Melissa disappeared, someone had contacted her from that payphone. And whatever was said during that brief conversation had clearly unsettled her. Back at the Carter home, investigators continued studying the crime scene photographs. One image in particular kept resurfacing. The kitchen counter. Milk still sitting there. Groceries partially unpacked. And something else just barely visible at the edge of the frame. A small folded piece of paper. The item had been collected during the original search and placed into evidence. At the time it looked insignificant, just another scrap among dozens of objects gathered from the house. But now detectives decided to examine it again. Inside the evidence bag, the paper looked like a grocery receipt. Printed at the store where Melissa had stopped that evening. The timestamp confirmed what investigators already knew. 6:03 p.m. But there was another detail that hadn't attracted much attention during the early days of the investigation. A handwritten note on the back. 3 numbers. Not a full phone number. Just 3 digits. 417. At first glance, the writing appeared rushed, almost like someone had scribbled the numbers while distracted. Detectives wondered whether the digits meant anything at all. Maybe part of a phone number Melissa intended to remember. Maybe a locker code. Maybe nothing. But investigators added the detail to the growing list of unanswered questions. Meanwhile, the dark sedan reported by witnesses continued to haunt the case. Police circulated descriptions to nearby towns, hoping someone might recognize the vehicle. Hundreds of tips came in during the first few months. Most went nowhere. A few sounded promising but collapsed under scrutiny. Dark sedans were everywhere. Without a license plate or a clear description of the driver, the clue remained frustratingly vague. Still, detectives refused to abandon the possibility. They began looking at another angle. What if the car belonged to someone Melissa knew? Someone who had a reason to visit her that night. Someone who wouldn't appear suspicious pulling into the driveway. The investigation turned toward Melissa's personal relationships again. Friends described her as private but kind. She kept a small social circle, co-workers, a few college friends, occasional family visits. Nothing dramatic. Nothing dangerous. But detectives noticed one small gap in her life. Melissa had ended a relationship roughly 6 months earlier. The man's name was Daniel Foster. He worked as a mechanic at a repair shop on the other side of town. The breakup, according to friends, had been quiet. No public arguments. No police reports. Just distance. Detectives contacted Foster quickly. He agreed to meet without hesitation. Inside the interview room, he appeared calm, almost confused about why investigators wanted to speak with him. Yes, he confirmed, he had dated Melissa. Yes, the relationship had ended months earlier. No, there had been no major conflict. Why did you break up? A detective asked. Foster shrugged. Just didn't work out. He explained that Melissa wanted stability. Marriage. A predictable future. He wasn't ready for that kind of commitment. So they drifted apart. The explanation sounded reasonable. But detectives noticed something else during the conversation. Foster seemed oddly distant when speaking about Melissa's disappearance. Not emotional. Not concerned. Just detached. When asked where he had been on the night Melissa vanished, Foster answered immediately. Working late. Several co-workers confirmed his presence at the garage until around 9 p.m. The alibi appeared solid. Still, investigators weren't ready to dismiss him entirely. They asked one more question. What kind of car do you drive? Foster replied without hesitation. A dark blue sedan. The room went quiet for a moment. It wasn't proof of anything. Thousands of people owned dark sedans. But the coincidence added a subtle layer of tension to the case. Detectives asked if they could look at the vehicle. Foster agreed. The car sat outside the repair shop the next morning. Dark blue. For doors. Snow and road salt crusted along the lower panels. Investigators examined it carefully. No visible damage. No signs of blood. No obvious evidence connecting the vehicle to Melissa's disappearance. But as they circled the car, one detail caught their attention. The tires. The tread pattern looked unusually worn. One detective crouched lower, comparing the pattern to photographs taken near Melissa's street weeks earlier. The tire tracks found near the intersection had been faint, partially melted, but investigators had documented them carefully before they disappeared. The pattern wasn't a perfect match. But it was similar. Too similar to ignore. Still, the evidence wasn't strong enough to accuse anyone. The case remained suspended in uncertainty. And as the months stretched toward a full year, the investigation slowly lost momentum. Leads faded. Witnesses stopped calling. Files moved quietly from active desks into long-term storage. Inside the department, detectives knew the truth even if they didn't say it out loud. Melissa Carter's case was slipping toward something every investigator dreads. A cold case. Unsolved. Unanswered. Frozen in time. But somewhere inside that thick evidence file, the forgotten grocery receipt still waited. The numbers scribbled on the back. 417. 3 simple digits. A meaningless note or the beginning of something far more important. Years would pass before anyone realized what those numbers truly meant. And when they finally did, the discovery would shake the entire investigation. Because those 3 digits were not random at all. They were a code. A clue pointing directly toward the person who had been closest to Melissa Carter in the final moments of her life. By the time the investigation crossed its first anniversary, the town had already begun doing what communities always do after tragedy. It moved on. The yellow police tape disappeared from Melissa Carter's yard. The winter snow that had once preserved faint tire tracks melted into spring mud and then dried beneath the summer sun. New families moved into nearby houses. Children rode bikes again along the same sidewalks where reporters once stood. But for the detectives who had worked the case from the beginning, the story never really left the room. Melissa Carter's file sat on a shelf inside the department's records office, a thick binder filled with photographs, transcripts, timelines, and unanswered questions. Every once in a while, someone pulled it down again. Flipped through the pages. Studied the same photographs. The tipped-over chair. The unopened milk. The quiet living room where a life had simply stopped. And every time they closed the folder, the same conclusion lingered. Something important had been missed. Not a dramatic clue. Not a smoking gun. Something smaller. Something subtle enough to slip past investigators during those first frantic weeks. Detective Robert Hayes believed that more strongly than anyone else. Hayes had been part of the original search team back in 1999. At the time he was younger, still new to major investigations, still learning the strange psychology of cases where victims vanish without a trace. But Melissa Carter's disappearance had stayed with him. Years later, long after the case had cooled, Hayes found himself returning to it late at night when the station grew quiet. There was something about the scene inside the house that refused to make sense. If someone had abducted Melissa, why leave the house untouched? If someone she trusted had visited, why had the encounter ended so abruptly? And if there had been a struggle, where was the evidence? Hayes started rereading the earliest reports, the documents written during the first 48 hours of the investigation. That's when detectives are closest to the truth. Before memories fade. Before theories take hold. Before small details are buried beneath months of speculation. One night, nearly 3 years after the disappearance, Hayes opened the property evidence inventory. The list contained dozens of items collected from Melissa's home. Kitchen utensils. Clothing. Paperwork. Receipts. Keys. Ordinary objects investigators gathered simply because they might matter later. One item caught his eye. Evidence bag 42. Description: grocery store receipt with handwritten numbers on reverse side. Hayes remembered the receipt. 3 digits scribbled on the back. 417. He had seen it during the early days of the investigation. At the time, it seemed insignificant. But now, looking at the number again, something nagged at him. Why would Melissa write 3 digits on the back of a receipt? If it were part of a phone number, there should have been more. If it were a code, investigators never discovered what it meant. But Hayes noticed something else. The handwriting looked hurried. The ink slightly smudged. Almost like someone had written the numbers quickly, perhaps during a conversation. He pulled the original receipt from evidence storage and placed it beneath a desk lamp. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. But the ink remained clear. 4 1 7. 3 simple numbers. Hayes turned the receipt over and studied the grocery list printed on the front. Bread. Milk. Pasta. Frozen dinner. Ordinary purchases. But something else appeared faintly beneath the store's printed logo. A timestamp. 6:03 p.m. That was the moment Melissa left the grocery store. And less than 20 minutes later she was home. Hayes stared at the receipt longer than he expected. Then he noticed something strange. The numbers weren't written perfectly straight. The 5 leaned slightly downward. The 1 was written harder, pressing deeper into the paper. The 7 trailed off with a quick motion. Almost like someone had written them while distracted. Or while standing. Maybe even while holding the receipt against a surface that wasn't completely steady. Hayes leaned back in his chair. Then another possibility occurred to him. What if Melissa hadn't written the numbers? What if someone else had? The idea sent a quiet pulse of tension through the room. If another person had written the digits, that meant someone had been close enough to her, close enough to grab the receipt, scribble the numbers, and hand it back. But who? And why only 3 digits? Hayes reopened the case file and began scanning through the witness interviews again. One name kept appearing throughout the documents. Daniel Foster. The former boyfriend. The man with the dark blue sedan. The man whose alibi had cleared him during the original investigation. Hayes wasn't convinced the story was finished. He pulled Foster's interview transcript from the file. The conversation looked routine at first glance. Questions about the relationship. Questions about the night Melissa disappeared. Foster's answers were calm, straightforward, almost rehearsed. But Hayes noticed a detail he had overlooked before. When detectives asked Foster whether he had spoken to Melissa recently, he paused. Just briefly. Then he answered. Not for a while. The hesitation lasted less than a second. But it was there. Hayes circled the line in the transcript. Then he looked back at the receipt again. 417. A strange thought surfaced. Those numbers might not represent a phone number. They might represent something else entirely. Something related to location. Hayes grabbed a map of the town and began scanning through street grids. Street numbers. House addresses. Area codes. Then his eye stopped on something unexpected. Highway route for 17 ran just outside town. The same road where the gas station payphone had been located. The same gas station that had been used to call Melissa's office days before she vanished. Hayes felt a chill crawl across the back of his neck. It might be coincidence. But coincidences have a strange habit of hiding truth inside them. If the number referred to route for 17, why would someone write it on the back of a grocery receipt? Was it a reminder? A meeting location? Or something else entirely? Hayes leaned forward, studying the ink again. That's when he noticed another detail. A faint smudge just above the numbers. Not ink. Something darker. Almost like a fingerprint pressed lightly against the paper. The original forensic tests back in 1999 had checked the receipt quickly for prints, but technology then had limits. Partial smudges were often dismissed. Now, years later, forensic science had advanced. Hayes realized something that made his pulse quicken. That receipt had never been fully re-examined with modern testing methods. It had simply been filed away, forgotten among dozens of minor evidence items. If someone else had handled that receipt, even briefly, traces might still be there. Skin cells. DNA. Microscopic evidence invisible to investigators years earlier. Hayes closed the evidence bag slowly. For the first time since the case had gone cold, a new possibility had emerged. A piece of evidence that might still speak. But reopening old evidence required approval. Paperwork. Review boards. Departments were cautious about revisiting cold cases without strong justification. Still, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling. That small grocery receipt, the one investigators had barely noticed in 1999, might hold the first real clue in years. And if modern technology could extract something from it? A fingerprint. A trace of DNA. Anything. Then the quiet Illinois cold case that had haunted the department for years might suddenly come roaring back to life. Because sometimes the smallest piece of evidence, the one everyone overlooked, becomes the one that finally breaks the silence. And if Hayes was right, the numbers on that receipt were not random at all. They were the beginning of a trail. A trail that might finally lead investigators back to the person who had stood inside Melissa Carter's kitchen on the night she disappeared. The person who had watched her unpack groceries. The person who had left the chair tipped over. And the person who had walked out of that house leaving behind nothing but silence. The evidence room had a smell detectives knew well. Paper. Cardboard. Dust. Thousands of cases slept inside those metal shelves, boxes filled with objects that once meant everything to an investigation and later became quiet relics of unfinished stories. Melissa Carter's case was one of them. For nearly 3 years the evidence bag containing the grocery receipt had remained untouched, sealed in plastic and labeled with a faded tag. It was just another minor artifact from a case that had slowly slipped into the cold file system. But now Detective Robert Hayes held it under the harsh white light of the forensic lab. And suddenly the small piece of paper didn't look insignificant anymore. The forensic technician assigned to the re-examination studied the receipt carefully before removing it from the bag with gloved hands. The process was slow and methodical. Evidence that old could be fragile, and one careless move could destroy whatever microscopic traces still remained. Hayes watched quietly. The technician placed the receipt beneath a magnification lens. Under the bright lamp, the ink looked darker than Hayes remembered. The numbers on the back still stood out clearly. 417. The technician tilted the paper slightly. Then leaned closer. "There's something here," she murmured. Hayes felt his pulse rise. "Fingerprint." "Maybe partial," she replied. "But not a full print." The smudge Hayes had noticed earlier appeared more clearly beneath magnification. It wasn't a perfect fingerprint pattern, just a partial ridgeline pressed lightly into the paper. Years earlier, that would have been the end of the examination. But technology had changed dramatically since 1999. Now investigators could recover DNA from the smallest traces of human contact, skin cells invisible to the naked eye. The technician explained the process carefully. Even touching an object briefly could leave behind microscopic biological material. A fingerprint smudge might contain thousands of tiny cells, enough to extract a genetic profile. But there was a risk. Time could degrade the sample. And if multiple people had handled the receipt over the years, the results might become complicated. Still, it was worth trying. The receipt was placed inside a sterile container and transferred for DNA extraction. Hayes left the lab with a strange feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Not certainty. But movement. For years the Melissa Carter case had sat frozen in the past, trapped by the limitations of the evidence collected during those first chaotic days. Now, suddenly, a forgotten object might speak again. While the forensic team began testing, Hayes reopened the investigation files and started reviewing everything connected to the number on the receipt. Route 417. The highway outside town. The gas station payphone. The same payphone that had been used to call Melissa's workplace days before she vanished. That detail now felt heavier than it had before. If the numbers on the receipt referred to the highway, perhaps they represented something more specific. A mile marker. An address. A meeting point. Hayes pulled out maps from the late 1990s, scanning through the rural areas surrounding the town. Route 417 stretched through farmland, patches of woods, and scattered roadside businesses. Several places stood along that road. The gas station. A closed diner. A small auto repair shop. And a cluster of storage units near the county line. Hayes circled each location carefully. Then he noticed something interesting. The repair shop on Route 417 had changed ownership in the early 2000s. Before that it had been run by a local mechanic. Daniel Foster. Hayes stared at the map. The coincidence felt uncomfortable. Foster had already appeared in the case once, Melissa's former boyfriend. The man with the dark blue sedan. The man whose alibi had cleared him during the original investigation. Now his name appeared again. Connected to the same highway number written on the receipt. Still, Hayes forced himself to stay cautious. Coincidences happen in investigations all the time. But the pattern was beginning to form. Foster had worked near Route 417. The payphone used to call Melissa's office sat on that same highway. And the mysterious number written on the receipt matched the route itself. The connection might mean nothing. Or it might mean everything. While Hayes reviewed those details, the forensic lab continued its work on the receipt. Days passed. Then a week. The waiting felt painfully familiar, the same slow uncertainty detectives face whenever evidence enters the lab. Finally, late one afternoon, Hayes received a call. The technician's voice sounded controlled but unmistakably energized. "You should come down here." Inside the lab, the receipt sat sealed inside a protective display case. Beside it, a computer monitor displayed rows of genetic data. The technician pointed at the screen. "We recovered DNA from the paper." Hayes felt a rush of adrenaline. Melissa's? Yes, the technician said. But not only hers. Hayes leaned closer. There it was. A second profile. Partial, but clear enough to identify as belonging to another individual. Someone else had handled that receipt. Someone who had left skin cells behind when the numbers were written. For years investigators had believed the receipt only belonged to Melissa. Now the evidence suggested something very different. Someone had stood close enough to her, perhaps inside the kitchen, to touch that piece of paper. And their DNA was still there. The next step was obvious. Compare the unknown DNA profile with samples collected during the original investigation. Hayes already knew whose sample he wanted to test first. Daniel Foster. Back in 1999, Foster had voluntarily provided fingerprints and a DNA swab during the early stages of the investigation. At the time, the sample had been stored but never directly connected to any physical evidence. Now the lab finally had something to compare it to. The technician ran the analysis. The computer processed the genetic markers slowly. Minutes stretched into silence. Hayes watched the progress bar crawl forward on the screen. Then the result appeared. The technician exhaled softly. "It's not a match." For a moment, the room felt strangely quiet. Foster's DNA did not match the sample from the receipt. The discovery shifted the investigation in an unexpected direction. If Foster hadn't written those numbers, someone else had. Someone investigators had never identified. But the technician wasn't finished. She pointed back at the screen. There's another possibility. The DNA sample recovered from the receipt was incomplete, degraded by time. But the lab could still run it through the national database for potential matches. The system contained thousands of profiles collected from criminals across the country. Sometimes cold cases were solved when old evidence was compared against newer entries. If the unknown person had ever been arrested for another crime, their DNA might now be sitting inside that database. Hayes nodded slowly. Run it. The search began. Some results came back quickly. Others required deeper comparison. Hours passed. Then the system flagged something. A possible match. Not perfect, but close enough to demand further testing. The name attached to the profile appeared on the screen. Hayes leaned forward. The name didn't belong to Daniel Foster. It belonged to someone investigators had never considered before. A man named Eric Dalton. The match wasn't confirmed yet, just a preliminary hit. But the profile in the database belonged to someone arrested years after Melissa Carter disappeared. A man who had lived in the same Illinois county. A man with a criminal history involving burglary and assault. And a man whose address during the late 1990s placed him disturbingly close to Route 417. The same highway written on the back of the receipt. Hayes felt the old case suddenly shifting beneath his feet. For 3 years the investigation had circled the same suspects, the same theories. Now a completely new name had entered the picture. Someone investigators had never questioned. Someone who might have been standing inside Melissa Carter's kitchen on the night she vanished. And if the DNA match held up under full testing, the quiet Illinois cold case that haunted the department for years was about to explode back into the spotlight. Because the forgotten evidence investigators once dismissed as meaningless had just revealed something no one expected. Melissa Carter had not been alone that night. And the person who stood beside her had finally left behind a trace strong enough to follow. The name Eric Dalton had never appeared in the Melissa Carter case file before. Not once. For years investigators had searched through dozens of suspects, former partners, co-workers, neighbors, strangers who happened to pass through town. Each lead had slowly collapsed under scrutiny, leaving the case suspended in uncertainty. Now suddenly, a name had surfaced from the shadows of a DNA database. Eric Dalton. Hayes studied the information appearing on the screen in the forensic lab. Dalton's profile had entered the national system years after Melissa disappeared, following an arrest connected to a burglary investigation in another Illinois county. Like many offenders processed through the system in the early 2000s, his DNA had been collected and logged. Back in 1999, that database barely existed. Now it held millions of profiles. Which meant something remarkable had just happened. A tiny trace of DNA recovered from a forgotten grocery receipt had reached forward through time and touched a man who investigators had never even known existed during the original investigation. But a database hit was not proof. Not yet. The technician explained the situation carefully. The sample taken from the receipt had degraded over time. Only part of the genetic sequence remained usable. The computer system had identified Dalton's profile as a close match, but further testing would be required to confirm it with certainty. Still, the probability was high enough to change everything. Hayes left the lab with the name repeating in his mind. Eric Dalton. The first step was to learn who he was. Back in his office, Hayes pulled every record he could find. Dalton's criminal history painted a picture that immediately caught investigators' attention. Burglary. Trespassing. Breaking and entering. None of the charges involved homicide. But the pattern was clear. Dalton had spent years slipping into places where he did not belong. The earliest arrests dated back to the late 1990s, the same period when Melissa Carter disappeared. Hayes dug deeper. Dalton's address history revealed something that made the connection even more unsettling. In 1999, Dalton had been living in a small rental house just outside town. Distance from Melissa's home, less than 4 miles. And the road connecting the two locations? Route 417. The same number written on the grocery receipt. The coincidence felt too sharp to ignore. Hayes called for a meeting with the department's cold case unit the following morning. Inside the briefing room, detectives spread maps and documents across the table. Dalton's photograph stared back from a driver's license record. Mid-30s. Lean build. Sharp cheekbones. Eyes that seemed slightly distant even in the still image. Investigators began piecing together his life during the winter of 1999. Dalton worked irregular jobs, construction, maintenance, occasional mechanic work. Nothing stable. Nothing tying him firmly to one place. But he had something else in common with the earlier suspect in the case. Daniel Foster. Both men had connections to auto repair work. Both lived near Route 417. And both owned dark-colored sedans during that period. The room fell quiet for a moment. Two men. Two dark cars. Both within miles of Melissa Carter's house. But only one of them had now appeared in the DNA evidence. Detectives pulled Dalton's employment records and found another disturbing detail. During early 1999, Dalton had worked briefly at a garage located directly along Route 417. The same stretch of road investigators had already connected to the mysterious payphone call Melissa received at work. Hayes leaned over the map again. If Dalton had been working near that gas station, he would have known about the payphone. He would have known the area well. And if he had been watching Melissa, he could have easily followed her home that evening. But another question emerged. Why would Dalton's DNA appear on the grocery receipt inside Melissa's house? There were only two possibilities. Either Dalton had been inside the home that night, or he had encountered Melissa somewhere else shortly before she returned. Detectives turned back to the timeline. Melissa left the grocery store at 6:07 p.m. She arrived home roughly 15 minutes later. That window of time suddenly became crucial. Had someone approached her in the parking lot? Had someone spoken to her before she drove away? The store surveillance footage from 1999 had long since been erased, but investigators still possessed a few still photographs captured during the original review. Grainy images of customers pushing carts through the aisles. Hayes pulled the photos from the archive. One by one, the images were scanned into a computer and enhanced using modern software. Faces blurred by the old camera quality began sharpening slightly. Shoppers appeared clearer than they had in the original investigation. Then one technician paused. Wait. A figure standing near the entrance caught their attention. The man wasn't facing the camera directly, but the side profile looked familiar. Lean face. Short dark hair. Investigators compared the image with Dalton's driver's license photograph. The resemblance was unsettling. Not conclusive, but close. If the man in the image was Dalton, that meant something extraordinary. He might have been inside the grocery store at the same time as Melissa Carter. Watching her. Waiting. The room filled with quiet tension as detectives stared at the screen. The timeline began to tighten. Melissa shops for groceries. Dalton appears near the store entrance. She leaves. He leaves. Minutes later, Melissa arrives home. And somewhere inside that house, the grocery receipt ends up with his DNA on it. The possibility changed the entire narrative of the case. For years, investigators had believed Melissa's disappearance began inside the house. Now it looked possible that the encounter started earlier. Perhaps in the parking lot. Perhaps with a stranger who approached her unexpectedly. But one detail still refused to fit. The handwritten numbers. 417. If Dalton had been the one writing those numbers, what did they mean? Was he referencing the highway near his home? A location he wanted Melissa to meet him? Or something else entirely? Detectives searched through Dalton's records again, looking for anything tied to those digits. Then a younger investigator noticed something strange. Dalton had once rented a storage unit near the county line. Unit number for 17. The discovery sent a ripple through the room. A storage unit. Private. Hidden. Large enough to conceal almost anything. Hayes felt the investigation shifting rapidly. For years the case had been paralyzed by the absence of a body, the absence of witnesses, the absence of proof. Now the forgotten receipt had produced a name. And that name had produced a location. A place investigators had never searched. A place that might have been connected to Dalton during the exact period when Melissa Carter vanished. The detective stared at the map again. The storage facility sat just off Route for 17, surrounded by empty farmland. Remote. Quiet. The kind of place no one would question a car arriving late at night. The kind of place someone might go if they needed privacy. If Dalton had used that unit during the winter of 1999, the implications were chilling. Hayes closed the file slowly. After years of silence, the Melissa Carter investigation was no longer cold. It was moving again. And somewhere along that lonely stretch of highway, the truth about what happened inside Melissa's house might still be waiting. Because the man investigators had never considered before was now standing directly in the center of the story. And if the evidence continued pointing in the same direction, the quiet Illinois mystery that had haunted the town for years was about to reveal something far darker than anyone had imagined. The storage facility sat exactly where the map said it would. A narrow gravel road broke away from Route for 17 and ran past a stretch of empty farmland before ending at a row of metal buildings that looked almost abandoned. The place had the quiet stillness of rural properties that survive mostly unnoticed, a few chain-link fences, faded signs warning against trespassing, and long rows of roll-up doors stretching toward the tree line. Detective Robert Hayes stepped out of the unmarked car and studied the property. Nearly 5 years had passed since Melissa Carter vanished. 5 years since the investigation had first combed through her house, searching for answers that never appeared. Now they were standing at a location that had never even been mentioned in the original file. Storage unit for 17. The number echoed strangely in Hayes' mind. The same digits written hurriedly on the back of the grocery receipt. The same digits recovered beside a partial DNA trace that had led investigators to Eric Dalton. The wind moved softly across the empty lot, rattling loose metal panels along the building walls. One of the detectives approached the office door at the front of the property. A small bell chimed as it opened. Inside, a middle-aged man looked up from a cluttered desk. The manager had owned the facility for more than 2 decades. When Hayes explained why they were there, the man frowned and began digging through old paper records stored in filing cabinets behind the counter. Back in 1999, everything had been recorded by hand. Paper contracts. Photocopies of driver's licenses. Stacks of receipts stapled to yellowed rental agreements. It took nearly 30 minutes before the manager found the document. Unit for 17. Rented February 1999. Name, Eric Dalton. The contract confirmed what investigators suspected. Dalton had been using the storage unit during the exact time period when Melissa Carter disappeared. Hayes asked the manager another question. Do you remember him? The man leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment. Tall guy, he finally said. Quiet. Didn't talk much. Did he come here often? Not really. Sometimes late at night. The answer sent a subtle tension through the room. Late at night. The manager continued flipping through the old paperwork. Dalton had kept the unit for nearly 6 months before suddenly ending the rental agreement during the summer of 1999. No explanation. Just a final payment and the key returned to the office. Hayes exchanged a glance with the other detectives. Melissa Carter vanished in January. Dalton closed the storage unit in July. 6 months of silence between those two events. 6 months where the contents of that unit remained completely unknown. The manager led investigators out into the yard. Unit for 17 sat near the far corner of the property, a metal door with peeling paint and a rusted lock that had been replaced years earlier. The unit had changed renters multiple times since Dalton gave it up. Whatever had once been stored there was long gone. Still, Hayes studied the building carefully. Inside, the space was roughly the size of a single-car garage. Concrete floor. Bare metal walls. The kind of place someone could store furniture, equipment, or something far more disturbing. But 5 years later, the original contents were impossible to recover. Whatever Dalton kept inside that unit had vanished with time. Even so, the discovery created a chilling possibility. If Dalton had encountered Melissa Carter on the evening she disappeared, he might have needed somewhere to take her. Somewhere private. Somewhere hidden. The storage unit fit that description perfectly. The detectives returned to the station with more questions than answers. But one thing had become clear. Eric Dalton was no longer a distant possibility. He was now the central figure in the investigation. Hayes began building a detailed timeline of Dalton's movements during the winter of 1999. Employment records. Utility bills. Traffic citations. Every scrap of information investigators could locate. One detail stood out immediately. Dalton's job at the garage along Route for 17 ended abruptly just 2 weeks after Melissa Carter disappeared. No notice. No explanation. He simply stopped showing up. When investigators contacted the former owner of the garage, the man remembered Dalton vaguely. He just quit one day, the owner said. Didn't say much. Packed his tools and left. The timing felt impossible to ignore. Melissa vanishes. 2 weeks later, Dalton disappears from his job. 3 months later, he relocates to another county. And 6 months after that, the storage unit is emptied and closed. Each step looked like someone slowly erasing pieces of their past. But Hayes knew that suspicions were not enough. They needed proof. DNA on the grocery receipt suggested Dalton had handled the paper. But that alone did not prove he was responsible for Melissa's disappearance. Investigators needed to know one thing above all else. Where was Eric Dalton now? The answer arrived quickly. Dalton was still living in Illinois. Still working occasional construction jobs. Still keeping a relatively low profile. But his life had not remained completely quiet. 3 years earlier, Dalton had been arrested during a burglary investigation. The charge had eventually been reduced, and he served only a short sentence before returning to civilian life. But the arrest had placed his DNA into the national database. The same database that had just connected him to the grocery receipt in Melissa Carter's house. Hayes studied Dalton's current address carefully. A small apartment complex about 70 miles away. Close enough to reach the town in under 90 minutes. The case had suddenly transformed from theory into something far more immediate. Detectives prepared quietly. Cold cases required caution. When investigators approached a suspect after so many years, the conversation often revealed far more than the evidence alone. People changed. Memories faded. But guilt had a strange way of lingering beneath the surface. Hayes planned the meeting carefully. No accusations. No mention of the DNA yet. Just questions. Because sometimes the most revealing moment in an interrogation is the one where the suspect doesn't realize what the detectives already know. 2 days later, Hayes drove toward Dalton's apartment building with another investigator seated beside him. The drive felt strangely familiar, long stretches of highway cutting through farmland, small towns passing quietly beyond the windshield. Somewhere along roads like these Melissa Carter had disappeared from the world. And somewhere along these same roads the man connected to the forgotten grocery receipt had continued living his life as if nothing had ever happened. The car pulled into the parking lot just after sunset. Dalton's building looked ordinary. 3 floors. Exterior staircases. Lights glowing in apartment windows. Children's bicycles leaning against a railing. Normal life. Hayes stepped out of the vehicle and climbed the stairs slowly. Apartment 3B. He knocked once. Inside, footsteps approached. The door opened. Eric Dalton stood there in the doorway. Older now than the photograph in the file. But unmistakably the same man. For a brief second, his eyes moved from Hayes to the detective standing behind him. Then back again. "Can I help you?" Dalton asked. Hayes held up his badge. "We're investigating an old case," he said calmly. "A disappearance from 1999. Dalton's expression remained steady. But something subtle shifted in his posture. Just a fraction. A tightening of the shoulders. A pause that lasted slightly longer than expected. And in that quiet moment, standing in the doorway of a small apartment 70 miles from the town where Melissa Carter vanished, Detective Robert Hayes felt the unmistakable sensation that the long-frozen case had finally reached the man who knew exactly what happened on that winter night. Eric Dalton didn't look like a man expecting visitors. The apartment behind him was dimly lit, a single lamp glowing from the corner of a small living room. A television hummed quietly somewhere inside. The air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and old carpet. For a moment, Dalton simply stood in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame, eyes studying the badges in front of him. Detective Robert Hayes kept his tone neutral. "We'd like to ask a few questions," he said. Dalton hesitated. "Just briefly." Then he stepped aside. "Sure," he muttered. "Come in." The detectives entered slowly. The apartment looked small and cluttered, tools stacked near the wall, empty soda cans on a coffee table, a thin layer of dust covering most surfaces. The place had the feeling of somewhere a person passed through life quietly, leaving little trace behind. Dalton sat down in an armchair while the detectives took seats across from him. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Hayes had conducted dozens of interviews over the years. He knew how important those first silent moments could be. People often revealed more through body language than through words. Dalton looked calm. But his eyes moved carefully from one detective to the other. Hayes finally spoke. "Do you remember a woman named Melissa Carter?" Dalton blinked once. Then shook his head. "No." The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Hayes nodded slightly, as if the response meant nothing. "She disappeared in January of 1999, he continued. "From a house not far from where you used to live." Dalton leaned back in the chair. "I lived in a lot of places," he said. Hayes placed a photograph on the table between them. Melissa Carter's driver's license image stared upward from the paper. Dalton glanced down at it. For a fraction of a second something passed across his face. Not recognition. But not complete confusion either. The expression vanished almost instantly. "Nope," Dalton said. "Never seen her." Hayes expected the denial. What mattered was how Dalton delivered it. Calm voice. Controlled breathing. But the man's right hand had started tapping lightly against the armrest. Tap. 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 Hayes leaned forward slightly. "Back in 1999 you worked at a repair shop along Route 417, he said. Dalton nodded slowly. "Yeah. For a while." "Do you remember a gas station near there?" "Sure. It had a payphone outside." Dalton shrugged. "Most places did back then." Hayes slid another photograph across the table. A grainy still image from the grocery store surveillance camera. The figure near the entrance. The partially visible face. Dalton studied the picture for a moment. Then leaned back again. "That could be anybody." "Maybe," Hayes replied quietly. "But it looks a lot like you." Dalton said nothing. Silence filled the room again. Then Hayes delivered the detail he had been holding back. "We found your DNA." Dalton's tapping stopped instantly. The room went still. Hayes let the words hang there for several seconds before continuing. On a grocery receipt inside Melissa Carter's house. Dalton stared at him. The calm expression remained, but now something sharper flickered beneath it. "That's impossible," he said. "Is it?" Hayes asked. Dalton shifted in the chair. "I never went to her house." The denial arrived quickly. Hayes didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back and folded his hands. The receipt had 3 numbers written on it, he said. 4. 1. 7. Dalton's eyes flickered again. The reaction lasted less than a second. But Hayes saw it. A flash of recognition. A tiny crack in the man's composure. "You ever rent a storage unit en route for 17? Hayes asked. Dalton didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, "That was a long time ago." "Yes," Hayes replied calmly. "It was." The detective leaned forward again. "You rented unit for 17 in February of 1999. Dalton's breathing had changed now. Still controlled. But slightly deeper. "We know you were at the grocery store the same evening Melissa Carter shopped there," Hayes continued. Dalton looked away toward the window. "We know you worked near the gas station where someone called her office 3 days before she disappeared." Still no response. "And we know your DNA ended up on the receipt she brought home that night." Hayes paused. The room felt smaller now. More intense. Dalton rubbed his hands together slowly. "That doesn't mean anything," he said. "It means you touched that receipt," Hayes replied. Dalton stared at the floor. Then finally looked up again. "Maybe I helped her carry groceries or something," he muttered. The explanation sounded weak even as he spoke it. Hayes watched him carefully. Inside her house. Dalton didn't answer. For the first time since the interview began, his confidence seemed to falter. Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply let the silence grow. Because silence often forced people to fill it. Dalton finally exhaled. "I might have talked to her," he admitted. The words came quietly. Hayes nodded once. "Where?" "At the store." "What did you talk about?" Dalton shrugged. "Directions maybe. I don't remember." "Then how did your DNA end up on the receipt inside her kitchen?" Dalton looked at Hayes again. And for the first time since the detectives arrived, the calm mask cracked just slightly. "I don't know," he said. The interview continued for another hour. Hayes circled the same questions repeatedly. The grocery store. The receipt. Route 417. The storage unit. Every time Dalton's answers shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Just small inconsistencies. First he claimed he had never seen Melissa. Then he admitted speaking with her at the store. First he denied touching the receipt. Then he suggested he might have handled it briefly. Each change made the story weaker. But still Dalton never admitted entering the house. And without a body, without witnesses, the case remained balanced on fragile evidence. Finally Hayes stood. "We may need to talk again," he said. Dalton nodded. "Okay." The detectives walked toward the door. Just before leaving, Hayes turned back one last time. "You know something about what happened to her," he said quietly. Dalton didn't respond. But his eyes followed the detectives until the door closed. Outside, the night air felt cold and sharp. Hayes stood beside the car for a moment, thinking. The interview had not produced a confession. But it had done something else. It had exposed fear. Dalton knew investigators were getting close. And people who fear exposure often make mistakes. Mistakes that reveal the truth. As Hayes drove away from the apartment complex, one thought refused to leave his mind. If Dalton had been inside Melissa Carter's house. If he had written those numbers on the receipt. Then somewhere out there, hidden beneath years of silence, the final piece of the mystery still existed. A place. A location. Somewhere along route for 17. Somewhere connected to unit for 17. A place where the truth about Melissa Carter's disappearance might still be waiting to be uncovered. And if that place could be found, the quiet cold case that haunted the Illinois town for more than half a decade might finally reveal what happened on that winter night in 1999. After the interview with Eric Dalton, the investigation entered a new and dangerous phase. For years, Melissa Carter's disappearance had been an unsolved mystery, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Detectives followed theories, chased rumors, searched woods and lakes, but everything eventually collapsed back into silence. Now the silence had been broken. Dalton had made mistakes. Small ones. The kind suspects make when they suddenly realize investigators know more than they expected. First he denied knowing Melissa Carter. Then he admitted speaking with her at the grocery store. First he claimed he had never touched the receipt. Then he suggested maybe he had helped her with groceries. Each shift created cracks in his story. And detectives knew something important. When people lie about small details, it usually means they're hiding something much bigger. Detective Robert Hayes returned to the station that night and reopened the case board that had been gathering dust for years. Photographs covered the wall. Melissa Carter smiling in her driver's license photo. The kitchen counter with groceries still sitting where she left them. The tipped-over chair in the living room. The scratch mark near the back door. And now a new photograph. Eric Dalton. Hayes pinned it beside the others. For the first time since 1999, the investigation had a face. But Hayes knew the truth about cold cases. Suspicion alone meant nothing in court. What they needed was evidence that could not be explained away. The grocery receipt proved Dalton had been near Melissa. But not necessarily that he harmed her. The detectives needed to find something stronger. Something physical. Something connected directly to the night she disappeared. And that meant returning once again to route for 17. The storage unit Dalton had rented was empty now. The original contents gone. But Hayes kept thinking about the manager's comment. Dalton visited the facility late at night. Not often. But enough that the man remembered. Late-night visits suggested secrecy. Someone arriving when no one else was watching. Someone who didn't want attention. The detectives decided to look beyond the storage facility itself. They expanded the search across the entire stretch of highway. Old property records. Abandoned buildings. Empty farmland. Any location Dalton might have used during those 6 months when he kept the storage unit. Investigators began interviewing people who lived along the road during the late 1990s. Farmers. Gas station employees. Truck drivers who passed through the area regularly. Most had nothing useful to report. Too much time had passed. Memories fade quickly when a crime leaves no obvious trace. But one conversation stood out. An elderly farmer named Harold Bishop lived about 2 miles past the storage facility. When detectives asked about unusual activity during the winter of 1999, the man hesitated. Then he mentioned something strange. Late one night, sometime in January, he had seen headlights moving slowly through a dirt access road behind his property. The road didn't lead anywhere important. Just an old drainage area near a line of trees. Probably kids messing around, Bishop said. But the timing caught Hayes' attention. January 1999. The same week Melissa Carter vanished. The detectives drove out to the location the next morning. The access road still existed, a narrow path cutting through fields before disappearing into a patch of woods near a shallow creek bed. The area looked quiet. Isolated. Exactly the kind of place someone might choose if they needed privacy. Hayes stepped out of the vehicle and studied the landscape. In winter, the trees would have been bare. The ground frozen. A car could easily pull off the road without leaving obvious tracks. They walked deeper into the tree line. Branches cracked underfoot as they moved through the brush. A few minutes later, one of the investigators stopped suddenly. "Look at this." The ground nearby had collapsed slightly into a shallow depression. Nothing dramatic. Just a subtle dip in the earth. But Hayes had seen similar shapes before. Graves don't always look like graves after many years. Time flattens them. Weather softens the edges. But sometimes the earth remembers. The detectives marked the location carefully and called in a search team. Ground-penetrating radar arrived that afternoon. The machine rolled slowly across the clearing, scanning beneath the soil. Everyone stood quietly watching the monitor. The radar display showed layers of dirt, roots, and rocks. Then a shape appeared. A disturbance in the soil roughly 6 feet long. Not natural. Not part of the surrounding ground pattern. Hayes felt his chest tighten. The shape looked exactly like what investigators feared. A burial site. The discovery didn't prove Melissa Carter was there. But the timing, the location, the connection to Dalton all pointed in the same direction. Excavation began the next morning. Shovels cut carefully through the frozen soil. Layer by layer, the earth was removed. Detectives stood nearby, watching every movement. No one spoke. Because everyone knew what they might find. After nearly 2 hours of digging, one of the search technicians froze. "Stop." The shovel had struck something solid. Not rock. Something lighter. The team cleared away the surrounding dirt with small brushes. Then the shape appeared clearly. Bone. Human bone. A fragment of a rib cage emerging slowly from the ground. The entire site went silent. Hayes felt the same heavy realization settling over everyone present. After 5 years of uncertainty, they had finally found a body. But confirmation would take time. Forensic specialists carefully expanded the excavation. More bones appeared beneath the soil. A skull. Fragments of clothing. A rusted metal zipper. Everything placed exactly where time had left it. And as the remains were lifted carefully into evidence containers, Hayes noticed something chilling. The body had been buried roughly 3 feet below the surface. Quick. Shallow. The kind of grave someone might dig in darkness, working fast before dawn arrived. Whoever placed the body there had not expected anyone to find it. Not after so many years. But now the earth had given up its secret. And the quiet cold case that haunted the Illinois town was no longer just a disappearance. It had become something far more devastating. A homicide. But one question still remained. Was the body buried along Route 417 truly Melissa Carter? Or had the investigators just uncovered an even darker mystery hiding beneath the soil? The answer would come soon. And when it did, it would bring detectives closer than ever to the truth about the man who stood inside Melissa's kitchen on the night she vanished. Eric Dalton. The excavation site along Route 417 quickly transformed from a quiet patch of farmland into a full forensic scene. Yellow tape stretched between trees. Patrol vehicles lined the narrow access road. Investigators moved carefully across the muddy clearing, documenting every inch of the ground where the remains had been found. For Detective Robert Hayes, the moment felt surreal. 5 years earlier, Melissa Carter had vanished without a trace. No body. No clear crime scene. Just a silent house and a list of unanswered questions. Now those questions were lying in the dirt. The skeletal remains had been buried shallowly beneath the tree line, wrapped in fragments of what appeared to be an old blanket or tarp. Time had degraded most of the material, leaving only fibers tangled between bones. Forensic technicians worked slowly, brushing soil away from each fragment before placing it carefully into labeled evidence containers. Hayes watched quietly. The shape of the skeleton suggested an adult female. But official confirmation would require more work. Anthropologists would examine the bones. Dental records would be compared. DNA samples would be extracted. Every step needed to be exact. Because if the remains belonged to Melissa Carter, the investigation would change forever. While the recovery continued, another team of detectives returned to the station to review Eric Dalton's file again. Now the pieces of the timeline looked far more dangerous than they had before. January 1999, Melissa disappears. February 1999, Dalton rents storage unit for 17. Spring 1999, Dalton visits the facility late at night several times. Summer 1999, Dalton abruptly closes the storage unit. 2 weeks after Melissa vanishes, Dalton quits his job at the garage along Route for 17. And now human remains have been discovered less than 2 miles from that same highway. The pattern was tightening. But Hayes knew something important. Finding a body near a suspect's former residence did not automatically prove guilt. Prosecutors would demand stronger evidence, something directly linking Dalton to the burial site or to the victim herself. Fortunately, the excavation had already produced more than just bones. A small personal object had been discovered beside the remains. A ring. Simple silver band. For years Melissa Carter's parents had described one item she never removed, a small ring she wore on her right hand. A gift from her sister years earlier. The forensic team photographed the ring carefully before sealing it in an evidence bag. If the Carter family recognized it, that alone would strongly suggest the body belonged to Melissa. But Hayes still waited for scientific confirmation. Because after 5 years of uncertainty, the truth needed to be undeniable. 2 days later, the call came from the forensic lab. Preliminary results were ready. Hayes walked into the laboratory with the same quiet tension he had felt when the grocery receipt first revealed its hidden DNA. The forensic anthropologist explained the findings. The skeletal structure matched an adult female between the ages of 30 and 40. Melissa Carter had been 34 when she disappeared. The height estimate also matched. Then came the dental comparison. Melissa's dentist still had her original X-rays on file. When the images were compared with the teeth recovered from the burial site, the match was immediate. There was no longer any doubt. After 5 years, Melissa Carter had finally been found. Hayes felt a strange mixture of relief and heaviness settle over the room. The mystery of her disappearance was over. But the truth behind it had become far darker. Because the condition of the remains revealed something investigators had feared from the beginning. Melissa Carter had not died accidentally. The bones showed clear trauma. The forensic pathologist pointed to fractures along the skull. Blunt force trauma. Repeated impact. The kind of injuries caused by a heavy object. Or violent blows against a hard surface. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment. Inside that quiet suburban house back in 1999, something terrible had happened. The tipped-over chair. The half-unpacked groceries. The silence left behind when the front door closed. Now the violence of that moment had finally surfaced from the ground. Melissa Carter had been murdered. The next step in the investigation came quickly. Detectives returned to Eric Dalton's apartment with a warrant. This time, the conversation would be very different. Dalton answered the door again. But the calm expression he had worn during the first interview disappeared the moment he saw the officers behind Hayes. "Eric Dalton," Hayes said firmly. "We're placing you under arrest in connection with the murder of Melissa Carter." Dalton froze. For a moment it looked as if he might speak. But no words came. The handcuffs clicked into place. Neighbors stepped out onto their balconies, watching silently as the man was escorted down the staircase. Inside the patrol car, Dalton stared forward without speaking. The drive back to the station felt long and quiet. But Hayes knew something about cases like this. Arrests sometimes break people. Years of silence collapse under pressure. And once the truth begins to surface, it rarely stops. Inside the interrogation room, Dalton sat alone beneath the bright overhead light. The detectives placed photographs on the table in front of him. The excavation site. The skeletal remains. The silver ring. Finally, Hayes added one more image. Melissa Carter's face. "You buried her along Route for 17, Hayes said quietly. Dalton stared at the table. No response. "We found her," Hayes continued. Still silence. But this time the man's shoulders began to shake slightly. 5 years of secrets were pressing down inside that small room. 5 years of hiding the truth. And somewhere inside Dalton's mind the memory of that winter night in 1999 was beginning to surface again. The night he followed a woman home from a grocery store. The night a simple conversation turned violent. The night Melissa Carter disappeared from the world. Now the evidence had caught up with him. And the final piece of the story was about to emerge. Because sometimes the truth buried in the ground refuses to stay hidden forever. And when it finally rises back into the light, it brings the entire story with it. The interrogation room felt colder than usual. Eric Dalton sat beneath the fluorescent light, his hands cuffed to the metal ring bolted into the table. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of electricity overhead and the distant murmur of voices somewhere in the police station hallway. Detective Robert Hayes sat across from him. Between them lay the photographs. Melissa Carter's driver's license photo. The excavation site along Route for 17. The skeletal remains slowly uncovered from the soil. And the silver ring resting in an evidence bag. Dalton had not spoken in nearly 10 minutes. He stared at the table as if the surface might open and swallow the images whole. Hayes didn't rush him. Interrogations were rarely about shouting or forcing answers. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in a room like this was patience. Because when suspects sit alone with the truth long enough, the silence becomes unbearable. Finally Dalton exhaled slowly. "You said you found her," he muttered. Hayes nodded once. "Yes." Dalton's eyes moved briefly toward the photograph of the burial site. "Where?" "Near the creek line off Route for 17. For a moment Dalton closed his eyes. The detectives in the observation room watched through the glass, barely breathing. Something inside him was shifting. 5 years earlier, Dalton had buried a secret in the ground and walked away believing the earth would keep it forever. But the earth had given it back. And now the truth sat on the table in front of him. Dalton rubbed his face with both hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said quietly. The words landed heavily in the room. Not a full confession. But close enough that Hayes felt the tension snap. "What happened?" Hayes asked. Dalton stared at the floor. "It was supposed to be nothing," he murmured. His voice sounded distant now, as if the memory itself was pulling him backward through time. "I saw her at the grocery store." The room stayed silent while he spoke. "She dropped her receipt at the checkout counter," Dalton continued. "I picked it up and handed it back." Hayes recognized the detail immediately. The grocery receipt. The same piece of paper that had carried Dalton's DNA across 5 years. "She thanked me," Dalton said. For a moment his voice softened slightly, as if remembering something ordinary. "We talked for a minute. Nothing big. Just small talk." Dalton swallowed hard. "Then I walked outside and saw her again in the parking lot." Hayes watched him carefully. Dalton's hands trembled slightly against the metal cuffs. "She looked familiar," Dalton continued. "I thought maybe she lived near my place." "So you followed her," Hayes said quietly. Dalton nodded. "Not at first. I just drove behind her. Same direction." The memory seemed to tighten around him. "Then she pulled into a neighborhood. I was already there, so I kept going." Hayes didn't interrupt. Dalton stared at the photograph of Melissa Carter. "I don't know why I knocked on the door," he said finally. But Hayes understood. Sometimes predators didn't plan their actions carefully. Sometimes they simply acted on impulse. "What happened when she opened the door?" Hayes asked. Dalton's jaw tightened. "I asked her if she had dropped something at the store," he said. Hayes glanced at the receipt photograph. The story was starting to make sense. Dalton had written the numbers on the back, for 17, perhaps intending to give her his contact information or to create a reason to return. A small lie to start a conversation. Dalton continued speaking slowly. "She let me in for a second. Just to check." Inside the house. The moment investigators had been trying to understand for years. She turned toward the kitchen, Dalton said. Started unpacking groceries again. The detectives could picture the scene perfectly now. The milk on the counter. The bread placed in the cabinet. The chair knocked over during the struggle. What happened next? Hayes asked. Dalton's breathing grew heavier. "I asked her if she wanted to get a drink sometime." Hayes waited. "She said no." The word seemed to echo faintly in the small room. "She told me to leave." Dalton's voice cracked slightly. "I got angry." The moment everything changed. The quiet suburban house. The normal evening routine. And then violence. "I grabbed her arm," Dalton said. She tried to pull away. Hayes saw the memory tightening across Dalton's face. The chair fell over. Exactly as investigators had seen it in the photographs. She screamed, Dalton whispered. "And I hit her." The room went completely still. "How many times?" Hayes asked softly. Dalton didn't answer immediately. "2, he finally said. "Maybe 3. Blunt force trauma." Exactly what the forensic pathologist had described. Dalton lowered his head. She stopped moving. The silence that followed felt endless. For years the house had held the echoes of that moment. Now the truth was finally spoken out loud. "What did you do then?" Hayes asked. Dalton's voice became almost mechanical. "I panicked." He described wrapping Melissa's body in a blanket from the couch. Loading her into the trunk of his car. Driving along the dark road outside town. Route 417. The same road where the storage unit stood. The same road where the burial site waited near the trees. "I dug for hours," Dalton said. The ground was frozen. Hayes could imagine the scene clearly. A man alone in the dark. Shovel striking frozen soil. Working fast, terrified someone might see headlights in the distance. "I thought nobody would ever find her," Dalton whispered. For 5 years he had been right. Until one forgotten grocery receipt reopened the entire case. Hayes leaned back slowly in his chair. The story was complete now. The mystery that haunted the town had finally reached its end. But the weight of the truth remained heavy in the room. Melissa Carter's life had ended in a moment of rage inside her own home. A quiet evening interrupted by a stranger who refused to accept rejection. Outside the interrogation room window, the night stretched across the city. Cars passed on distant streets. People returned home from work. Ordinary lives continuing without interruption. But in one Illinois town, a story that began in silence during the winter of 1999 had finally reached its conclusion. A cold case buried for years. A forgotten piece of evidence. And a truth that refused to stay hidden forever. Because sometimes justice does not arrive quickly. Sometimes it waits patiently in an evidence locker. Inside a faded receipt. Inside 3 small numbers written in hurried ink. Eric Dalton sat motionless in the interrogation room. The photographs on the table remained exactly where Detective Robert Hayes had placed them, the excavation site, the skeletal remains, the silver ring, and finally the smiling face of Melissa Carter. For several minutes, Dalton said nothing. Only the faint hum of the overhead lights filled the room. Hayes had conducted hundreds of interrogations during his career. He recognized the moment when silence stopped being resistance and started becoming pressure. Dalton's hands were clasped tightly together. His eyes never left the photograph. Finally, his voice came out quietly. "I didn't mean to kill her." The room remained still. Hayes leaned forward slightly but didn't interrupt. After 5 years, the truth was finally beginning to surface. Dalton swallowed and continued. On the night Melissa Carter disappeared in January 1999, he had been parked outside the same grocery store where she had been shopping. He noticed her leaving with several bags and followed her car out of the parking lot. At the time, Dalton claimed he only intended to talk. He had been drinking earlier that evening and later told detectives he was lonely. When Melissa pulled into her driveway, Dalton parked down the street and approached the house after she went inside. He knocked on the door. Melissa answered. Dalton said he asked if she could help him with directions. When she tried to close the door, he pushed his way inside. What followed matched the evidence detectives had seen years earlier. The tipped-over chair. The groceries left on the floor. A struggle in the kitchen. Melissa fought back. Dalton admitted she grabbed a nearby object and tried to defend herself. During the struggle he struck her multiple times with a heavy tool he had been carrying in his jacket, a tire iron from his car. The blows were fatal. Dalton told investigators that when he realized Melissa wasn't moving, panic set in. He dragged her body to his vehicle and drove out toward Route 417 in the early hours of the morning. At the time, the rural farmland beyond the highway had very little development. Dalton buried her near the tree line, covering the shallow grave with dirt and leaves before returning home. For years he believed the body would never be found. Melissa Carter's disappearance slowly became a cold case. The investigation stalled. And Dalton continued living his life quietly in the same city. What he didn't know was that the smallest piece of forgotten evidence would eventually reopen the entire investigation. A simple grocery receipt. DNA left behind on paper. Hayes listened carefully as Dalton finished his statement. The confession matched nearly every detail investigators had uncovered since reopening the case. The timeline. The storage unit records. The burial site. The injuries described by the forensic pathologist. Everything aligned. For Melissa Carter's family, the news was both devastating and relieving. For 5 years they had lived with uncertainty, not knowing whether Melissa might still be alive somewhere. Now they finally had answers. And they could bring her home. During the trial, prosecutors presented the full chain of evidence. Dalton's DNA on the receipt recovered from Melissa's kitchen. The forensic match from the burial site. Dental confirmation of the remains. And finally, Dalton's recorded confession. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Eric Dalton was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Detective Hayes attended the sentencing quietly from the back of the courtroom. Melissa Carter's sister spoke during the victim impact statement. She held the same photograph Hayes had placed on the interrogation table. Melissa trusted people, she said. That's who she was. She believed strangers deserved kindness. Her voice shook slightly. And someone used that kindness against her. When the hearing ended, the Carter family stepped outside the courthouse together. For the first time in years, the long unanswered question had finally been resolved. Cold cases often remain buried in boxes for decades. But sometimes, all it takes is one overlooked detail, one tiny fragment of evidence, to reopen the door. In this case, the answer had been waiting quietly inside a forgotten grocery receipt. A small piece of paper that refused to let the truth disappear. And because of it, Melissa Carter's story was finally told. Although Eric Dalton had already been sentenced to life in prison, the story of the case did not end when the courtroom emptied. For Detective Robert Hayes, the investigation left a lasting impact. Cold cases often sit untouched for years, sometimes decades. Files grow thick with paperwork while witnesses move away, memories fade, and physical evidence slowly deteriorates. But the Carter case became an example inside the department of something important. Old evidence can still speak. After the conviction, the department began reviewing several other unsolved cases from the late 1990s. Advances in forensic science, especially modern DNA testing, were giving investigators tools that simply did not exist when many of those crimes originally occurred. The grocery receipt that reopened Melissa Carter's case became part of training presentations for younger detectives. Hayes would hold up a photograph of the evidence and repeat the same line every time. "Nothing is too small to matter." The receipt had been sitting quietly inside an evidence envelope for 5 years. At the time it was collected, investigators had no way to extract usable DNA from the thin paper fibers. The technology simply wasn't available yet. But once testing methods improved, the evidence finally revealed what it had been holding all along. A fingerprint might fade. Witnesses might forget. But DNA has a way of waiting. Melissa Carter's family also worked to ensure her story would help others. Her sister later partnered with a victims advocacy group to support families dealing with missing persons cases. One of the most difficult parts of those situations, she explained, is the uncertainty. Not knowing whether a loved one is alive or gone can freeze time in a painful way. In Melissa's case, the discovery of her remains brought heartbreaking confirmation, but it also brought closure. Years after the trial, a small memorial bench was placed in a public park near Melissa's old neighborhood. The plaque simply reads, "Melissa Carter, 1974 to 1999. Remembered for her kindness." Visitors sometimes leave small flowers beside the bench. Detective Hayes returned once, several months after the sentencing. The park was quiet that afternoon. He sat on the bench for a few minutes, thinking about how the investigation had unfolded. 5 years of silence. A forgotten receipt. A buried grave near Route for 17. And a story that might have remained hidden forever. Cases like this remind investigators why cold case units exist. Because sometimes justice doesn't come quickly. Sometimes it takes years. But when the truth finally surfaces, even the smallest piece of evidence can change everything. And in Melissa Carter's case, that small piece of evidence ensured that her story, and the truth behind her disappearance, would never be forgotten. In the years following the Carter case, investigators across Illinois began taking a closer look at how cold cases were handled. Detective Robert Hayes was often invited to speak to newer detectives about the investigation. He never described the case as brilliant police work. Instead, he described it as patience and attention to details most people would overlook. During one training session, Hayes placed a photocopy of the grocery receipt on the table in front of the class. He asked the detectives a simple question. "What do you see?" Most of them answered the same way. "A receipt." But Hayes explained what investigators had eventually learned to see instead. A timeline. A location. A possible contact between victim and suspect. And most importantly, a surface capable of preserving DNA. At the time Melissa Carter disappeared in 1999, forensic testing had not yet reached the level detectives rely on today. Many materials, including thin paper like receipts, were considered unreliable for DNA recovery. By the early 2000s, however, improvements in forensic extraction methods allowed laboratories to recover genetic material from surfaces investigators once thought were useless. That single advancement changed the entire direction of the Carter investigation. And it changed the way the department treated evidence moving forward. After the case closed, the evidence storage policy was updated. Items that might once have been discarded after initial testing were now preserved whenever possible. Because science was constantly improving. What seemed impossible today might become routine tomorrow. Melissa Carter's story also reached beyond law enforcement. Local universities began using the case as an example in criminal justice programs when teaching forensic evidence and investigative persistence. Students often studied the timeline to understand how small clues can connect years later. For the Carter family, the case remained deeply personal. Melissa's sister visited the memorial bench several times each year. Friends sometimes joined her on Melissa's birthday. They would bring flowers, share stories, and remember the small everyday details that had defined her life, her humor, her generosity, and the way she always tried to help people. Those memories became more important than the tragedy itself. Because long before the crime, Melissa Carter had been a sister, a friend, and a person who believed in kindness. And that is how the people closest to her chose to remember her? The Carter case is now considered one of the region's most notable cold case breakthroughs. Not because it involved dramatic chases or sudden confessions, but because it proved something quieter and more powerful. Time does not always erase the truth. Sometimes it protects it. Sometimes the evidence simply waits, stored in a file box, sealed inside an envelope, or buried beneath the soil, until the moment investigators are finally able to see it clearly. And when that moment arrives, even the smallest clue can bring an entire story back into the light. For Detective Hayes, the lesson stayed simple. Never assume a case is finished just because the years have passed. Because somewhere, hidden in the details, the truth may still be waiting to be found.